Hello, my name is Jonathan Westcott. I'm a civil engineer at FEMA headquarters in our building science branch. I led the development of FEMA's Building Code SAVE study, and I'm here with the lead subject matter experts to tell you about it. Dr. Parson is a natural hazard and climate change modeling analyst with AECOM and led the study's flood module. Dr. Lavelle is a vice president and principal engineer at Applied Research Associates, who helped develop the HAZUS software and led the hurricane wind module for this study. Ms. Seligson is a HAZUS expert with over 30 years of experience in the areas of natural hazard risk assessment and loss estimation, and led the study's earthquake module. Mr. Francis is a senior principal at AECOM and served as the overall technical lead. We're all excited to be here to tell you about the study. Following my introduction, I'll pass it on to Dr. Parson to describe the study methodology and data processing and provide an overview and results of the flood module. Next, Dr. Lavelle will describe the hurricane wind module and results. Then Ms. Seligson will provide an overview and results of the earthquake module before turning it over to Mr. Francis to discuss the nationwide results. Then I'll wrap up by describing the brochure we developed as a companion to the study. We had lots of partners and contributors to the study. In addition to everyone here with me today and all those who work to support them, we benefited from input from numerous FEMA subject matter experts. We also had an external review panel consisting of members from the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, the International Code Council, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the National Association of Home Builders, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, a university, and a local official. We even have more partners in outreaching our results, including the Association of State Floodplain Managers, the Applied Technology Council, and other organizations interested in code adoption. Lastly, I want to recognize Ed Latch at FEMA for providing the long-term vision and executive leadership for this study. FEMA places a strong emphasis on building codes because they enhance public safety and property protection. Model building codes are more disaster resistant than ever, and the benefits of strong code adoption and enforcement become evident following disasters. FEMA's mitigation assessment teams and others have documented significant reduction in damages to structures built to modern hazard-resistant codes. The National Institute of Building Sciences, in their Mitigation Saves study, found that adopting modern building code saves $11 for every $1 invested. Yet despite the effectiveness of modern building codes, disaster costs are huge and rising and affect tens of millions of Americans. That's where our nation's mitigation investment strategy calls for making mitigation standard practice and recognizes the importance of strong building codes in making that happen. Still, surprisingly to some, about 2/3 of our nation's jurisdictions have not yet adopted a recent edition of the model codes. We need to change that in order to maximize their significant benefits. So the goals of the study are to demonstrate the monetary benefit of adopting hazard-resistant building codes, to do so by quantifying the effect of building codes in reducing losses during disasters, and importantly, to use our results to incentivize better code adoption. This study quantifies the losses avoided from the adoption of modern hazard-resistant building codes. Using big data sets and an engineering-based methodology, we've used HAZUS, FEMA's loss estimation tool, to model key structural characteristics of hazard-resistant building codes as they were adopted over time by communities across the country. Buildings constructed with these characteristics, which our subject matter experts will describe in more detail, experience fewer losses when exposed to hurricane winds, flooding, and earthquakes, the three hazards we evaluated as part of this study. We found that the nation is saving $1.6 billion in average annualized losses avoided, thanks to the states and communities across the country that have adopted hazard-resistant building codes since 2000. Further, we estimate that about $32 billion has been saved over the past 20 years, and projecting forward, Assuming contemporary development and adoption patterns continue, we could save 132 billion by 2040. Now that number goes up significantly if we improve code adoption across the country. There's a lot that goes into these results, but before I turn it over to the subject matter experts to go into the details, I want to point out that our analysis only accounts for buildings and contents damages. When you consider the cascading losses that are also avoided, such as relocation costs, business interruption, lost wages, and other socioeconomic factors, it's clear that the true value of hazard-resistant building codes is much greater. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Parson to describe the study methodology and data processing and provide an overview of the flood module.
Hi, I'm Shane Parson with AECOM, member of the Compass joint venture supporting FEMA for RISMAP. I'm going to be talking about, for the Building Code SAVE study, information on methodology, data, and also the flood analysis. So to start off, I want to do a few definitions of terms that you're going to be seeing throughout this presentation. First one is average annualized loss. This refers to a loss estimate that's based on a suite of return periods. So looking at modeling damages, not just for one event, but for multiple events. The next term is average annual losses avoided. That is when we have two different scenarios we're comparing, let's say with building code and without building code or pre-code. And we're comparing the average annualized loss between those two scenarios. That difference is the losses avoided associated with that. In some cases, when a building is strengthened, having code versus not having code will have a positive losses avoided. But there are some circumstances where values will be either low or zero, can indicate where we don't have an actual difference in code conditions, can also be a data gap issue. Also, we can have cases where it's negative, where the pre-code condition might have been a conservative standard for construction and building, so it actually was stronger than later editions of codes where there was more prescriptive and more detailed information that was able in a given location to possibly slightly weaken the codes in those areas. So these are four terms that you'll be seeing throughout the rest of this presentation. Okay, so building code methodology. How do we go about actually conducting the Building Code SAVE study? So building on past experience from pilot studies and regional studies, we found out that our main data needs were information about assets or structures, code adoption histories, and then the actual hazard mapping itself. So our first step in the effort is really data collection, getting information that provides a way to be able to assign at a structure level both hazard severities over different return periods, and also code adoption history to know that a given structure built on a certain date can be expected to have been built to a certain code edition. That information is then used to assign fragility or damage curves to structures. All of that info is then put within HAZUS or a HAZUS-like framework to model losses. And remember, because it's a losses avoided study for Building Code SAVES, we compare a pre-code condition with a post-code or after-code adoption. Those are our comparisons. So we get those results out of HAZUS, we do comparisons, and then we look at it from a quality standpoint to say, did the results come out the way we expected on both the scale and on a geographic basis? Make sure that we have quality results from our methodology. So those are the main steps in the methodology. Losses avoided computations. So how do we go through the process of actually doing the math to make this work? We do simulations of a pre-code condition and a post-code or with code condition, and we compare the losses for both of those. For flooding, the main comparison is with having freeboard for the with code condition and not having freeboard or being built to the standard BFE or 100-year floodplain flood elevation. So those are the comparisons for those. For hurricane wind, the difference is really comparing a with code that has practices such as shutters and strengthened roof connections with a pre-code that would be more of a standard building type without those considerations. And for seismic, the with code would be again, structural design and measures in place to withstand seismic forces versus a more standard design of a structure that wouldn't have that additional strengthening. So in the comparison of the two scenarios, the idea is that when we model that and we have our fragility curves that represent each of these, that we should be seeing that adding these strengthenings will end up giving us less damages. So let's talk a little bit about data collection. Our three main data sets that we needed for this study were asset data, code adoption data, and hazard data. Our main source for asset data was CoreLogic national parcel data that was also supplemented with Microsoft Bing footprints, allowing us to have a near nationwide coverage of structures around the US. For code adoption, we used a combination of national data sources from ICC, also some of the rating services such as BSEGS, and then for certain hazards, also getting local adoption data through some hazard-specific data sets. So for instance, we'll talk about for flood, the use of the community rating system database as well for that. For hazard data, we really look to the common sources for this information. For flood, that comes from FEMA, both from their NFHL, National Flood Hazard Layer, and then also some supplemental data in areas where all the data isn't digital at this point. For hurricane wind, those come from the ASCE designed wind data along with NOAA, past histories. And then for seismic, the standard USGS seismic data for the US. So all those are combined and used to attribute the individual structure data to allow us to then do the hazard specific modeling later on. So how do we do data processing? How did we go from kind of our source data down to usable data sets for each of our three hazards? So we started with the National CoreLogic data set of 147 million parcels. That data set was then first filtered to make sure we only had parcels that had construction on them. The attribute data then of that information was used to figure out, did we have the proper background info to know things about when a structure was constructed, when the different roof types, the other information needed to do the hazard specific analysis. As we boiled that data down, we also had a step where we used the Bing building footprints along with the parcel data to make sure that we had defendable individual building data records. In some cases, things like apartments and condos, you might have multiple parcels but one building. And then in other cases, you may have a parcel that actually has several buildings on it, and you would have to make sure that your parcel records correctly attribute each structure for what it's trying to represent. So there was a lot of data compilation that was needed to get to the final set of data, which for this study, we were looking at the year 2000 construction and later, and we ended up having a little over 18 million structures in this nationwide data set. If you look at the report, you can see some areas where there might have been a few gaps in the data, but we feel like this is a pretty good representation of post-2000 construction. So now let's talk a little bit about the flood analysis. Three main components of the flood analysis were assigning to each structure whether or not they had freeboard from a freeboard database that we developed, also assigning to each structure the flood profile, the ranges of flood elevations that particular building would expect for different return periods or recurrence intervals. And then finally, the assignment of depth damage functions related to the fragility of the building based on let's say, its foundation type, number of stories, its expected damage levels based on building characteristics. So once we were able to assign those to each structure, we then could run within HAZUS using that modeling framework comparisons of with and without code in order to get losses avoided associated with freeboard adoption. So how do we develop our freeboard adoption database? Our primary sources first came from national and state adoption records on different code editions, looking at over time how each state, because flood hazards are in all states, how each state either adopted statewide mandatory adoption of codes or decided to leave it up to jurisdictions. We also supplemented this information with other flood-specific databases, particularly the Community Rating System database, where communities that are part of that system are scored on various floodplain management criteria, one of which is freeboard, and actually has a specific score that relates to not just presence of freeboard, but the actual freeboard levels. So we were able to use that information to supplement some of the national data sources so that we had an idea from the year 2000 up through the end of the study timeframe of 2018 for each year and each state and each community, an idea of when freeboard was adopted in those communities. So what did we find out about freeboard adoption nationwide? If we took the country, we could kind of split it into three groups. The first group, which we titled the innovators, were those states that had statewide mandatory freeboard adoption prior to or up to the year 2000. So even when the code series first started, there were states within the U.S. that already had mandatory freeboard in all NFIP participating communities. The next group that we found, what we called emergent states. Those are ones that adopted mandatory state required freeboard after 2000 through 2018, through the end of our study. In some cases, it was done similar to the innovator states, where there was a state-wide requirement. In other cases, as the IRC and IBC required more and more freeboard, and up to the 2015 editions where it was required for all structures in the floodplain, many states, through their adoption of the ICC codes, had mandatory freeboard adopted as part of it. There were still a handful of states, though, that we titled as limited, meaning that only local adoption and no statewide mandatory freeboard adoption occurred. So there's a handful of states that are still in those conditions. And you can see from the figure the ratio of numbers of communities within each of the states, within these groups of states overall, where the states that were innovators and emergent having higher levels of average freeboard adoption than those in the limited, where only a handful may have had freeboard. So what are some of our flood analysis results that we found for the study? So we found that as part of this nationwide study, that our average annualized losses avoided were almost $500 million, around 484 million per year. That was derived from a little under 800,000 structures that were in the floodplain, of which roughly 400,000 we found to have freeboard. So around 51% of structures built at 2000 and afterwards, we found had freeboard. The average losses avoided per structure was around $1,200 per structure, which adds up, when you do the math, adds up to close to $500 million per year. We feel that this is an actual underestimate because we, again, limited our study looking at structure and contents damages. You can also see on this slide our top 10 states, top states being ones we expect with these with lots of growth or especially lots of floodplain development. And then you can also see on the map the areas of the country at county level, and you can get a sense of that distribution of communities that had freeboard and the losses avoided that came with it. And with that, I'm going to turn things now over to Frank Lavelle, who's going to talk about our hurricane wind results.
For the hurricane portion of the study, an enhanced version of the HAZUS hurricane methodology was developed. First, we extended the methodology to estimate losses for individual buildings, instead of just computing aggregate losses at the census tract or census block level. Next, we extended the methodology to infer key building design parameters, such as the presence or absence of shutters or hurricane straps, based on the year of construction and the local building code history. Finally, we developed a large library of new loss modification functions to explicitly account for several modern building code requirements that were not directly considered in the original HAZUS hurricane methodology. With these enhancements and many hours of cloud computing time, we were able to estimate average annual losses, or AALs, for over 9 million buildings constructed in 22 hurricane-exposed states between 2000 and 2018. 2 hurricane AALs were computed for each building, one based on the local building codes that were in force in the 1990s, and another based on the codes that were actually in force when the building was constructed. The difference between these two AALs is the average annual loss avoided due to the adoption of more modern building codes. This chart summarizes the timeline of 1 and 2 family residential building code adoption in the 22 hurricane states. There is a second timeline in the report for commercial building code adoption. Many states, such as Florida and North Carolina, have enacted legislation mandating that local jurisdictions adopt and enforce specific building codes, and some have amendments that alter specific provisions in the model codes and standards, such as the definition of the windborne debris region. In other states, such as Texas, building code adoption is a local decision. For most of those states, we relied on code adoption history data at the jurisdictional level that was obtained from the Building Code Effectiveness Grading Schedule database. Although the BCEGS database did not include every community, it enabled modeling of many communities for the 5 states shown in yellow. Losses avoided were not computed in jurisdictions where building code histories could not be obtained. Going forward, the results of the analysis show that the adoption of more modern building codes since the year 2000 will reduce expected hurricane losses by an average of $1.1 billion per year. Note that this figure only includes direct losses to buildings and their contents, and it will only increase as more new buildings are constructed and as more jurisdictions adopt and enforce modern building codes. Despite contributing just 18% of the post-2000 buildings in the hurricane wind hazard area, Florida accounts for 81% of the national hurricane wind losses avoided due to its high hurricane risk, rapid growth, and early statewide adoption of modern wind design requirements. Because Florida is a big driver of the total AALA, there is further analysis of its contribution in section 5.4.1 of the report. Texas has relatively low AALA because it doesn't have statewide code adoption, and a large fraction of its post-2000 construction was inland. South Carolina is the opposite story. It has a relatively high AALA due to its fairly early statewide code adoption and high growth along the coast. These maps illustrate the hurricane wind losses avoided in relative terms. The map on the left shows the reduction in AAL as a percentage of the pre-I-code AAL. The relative losses avoided are greatest in those coastal counties that were the earliest adopters of more modern building codes, including several northeastern counties. The counties shown in the darkest green have already reduced their expected losses by more than 25%. The map on the right shows the contribution of each county to the national total. This map highlights the very large contribution of the coastal counties in South and Central Florida. However, several coastal counties in the Carolinas, Northwest Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, and 2 Texas counties, Harris and Galveston, are also significant contributors to the national total. This final plot shows how hurricane losses avoided varied by year of construction. Savings from buildings constructed between 2000 and 2007 are mainly due to improvements in wind design criteria and building codes and standards that were developed and adopted in the years following Hurricanes Andrew and Iniki. In 2008, the savings jump up to about 35% with the introduction of mandatory windborne debris protection requirements and other improvements in the 2006 IBC and in amendments to the Florida Building Code following the hurricanes of 2004 and 2005. After that, the gradual improvement in savings is mainly due to increased I-code adoption. Due to differences in where new buildings were being constructed, we don't always see an increase in savings from year to year.
Thanks, Frank. The approach for the seismic analysis is laid out in this flowchart. The seismic-specific steps are delineated by the dashed red line. The focus of the seismic approach was to combine CoreLogic building data with various models and categorization schemes to assemble a building-specific database for execution of the HAZUS Advanced Engineering Building Module, or AEBM. The 2 key parameters for each building's analysis are the building's model building type, representing its construction material and lateral force resisting system, and its design level, indicative of its design strength. The execution of these steps resulted in a database that could be analyzed in the HAZUS AEBM to produce estimates of building and content losses under the pre-I-code and I-code conditions, as well as the resulting loss avoided. A key to determining each building's design level was understanding the community's code adoption history. This figure provides the post-1999 commercial building code adoption history developed for the 6 Western seismic states considered in this study. Because of their experience with relatively frequent earthquakes, the 6 seismic states adopted and enforced seismic provisions in their building codes long before the year 2000, generally based on the Uniform Building Code. In all areas except for several counties in Hawaii and parts of Alaska, the 1997 Uniform Building Code was in place immediately prior to the initial adoption of the I-codes. For the purposes of this study, the 1997 UBC was judged to be similar to the I-codes. As a result, the code assumed to be in place prior to the I-code or equivalent code is the 1994 UBC. As shown in the figure, California, Oregon, Utah, and Washington had statewide code adoption mandates prior to 2000, so their histories are more straightforward than those for Alaska and Hawaii, which have been assembled at the borough, county, or city level. An equivalent code adoption history was also developed for residential construction. The final post-2000 building database used in the seismic assessment included more than 2.4 million buildings. Most of this exposure is in California. For the 6 seismic states, the total average annual loss avoided for post-2000 construction is approximately $60 million, 8% relative to the pre-I-code losses. Most of the losses avoided occur in California, followed by Washington. Losses avoided in Oregon are small relative to its exposure because many structures in Oregon were assigned the same design level under both the pre-I-code and I-code design. This also occurs in Alaska, where there are fewer buildings, many of which have been built without the benefit of a building code. The relatively low losses avoided for seismic hazards, as compared to the other hazards, is a result of the relatively strong seismic provisions of the 1994 UBC, which was widely adopted across the western states and used as the baseline pre-I-code condition. Had there been areas with no seismic codes in use prior to 2000, the losses avoided would be considerably larger. Hawaii has a higher average annual loss avoided per building, moving it higher in the rankings. This results from substantial losses avoided for post and pier foundation houses in the higher hazard areas of Hawaii County, which will be discussed on the next slide. Small single-family residential construction in parts of Hawaii often use a post and pier foundation system, where the first floor is elevated by 2 to 3 feet above grade. This type of construction is more vulnerable to damage than conventional wood-framed buildings on slab foundations. After 2000, code required improvements to continuous load paths made these structures more resistant to damage. The performance of this type of building has been studied extensively, and custom HAZUS capacity and fragility curves reflecting the code required load path improvements have been developed by FEMA. For these post and pier buildings, the losses avoided as a percentage of pre-I-code loss averages 21%, significantly higher than the 8% achieved in the seismic states overall. These higher relative average annual loss avoided results occur because the pre-I-code condition is highly vulnerable. The results from this unique building type indicate that larger losses avoided would result in the West if seismic codes had not been in place for decades and comparisons were made between no code and current code. And now I'd like to turn it over to Matt.
Hello, I'm Matthew Francis with AECOM, and I'll be talking about in the next 3 slides, bringing together the results of the earthquake and the hurricane and the flood findings from BCS. In the table, you can see that hurricane dominates the average annualized losses avoided. And that's because it's a large geographic area. We're covering every building in the states, in those hurricane states. And the hazard provisions in the code are very effective for hurricane, so we see high losses avoided. And also, the flood, while it is a lesser number, still is a significant amount of losses avoided at $484 million. And that's only those buildings that are in the special flood hazard area. That's where the freeboard, which is contributing to those losses avoided, is occurring. And seismic, of course, is a much smaller number, given that they have been adopting seismic provisions well before 2000. And so the incremental benefit is smaller, but still significant if you look at how these average annualized numbers aggregate over a period of time. Even the seismic, where we've had 20 years since a big event, is up in the near $1 billion savings when an event strikes. So one thing to note is that the 4 states of Florida, California, Texas, and South Carolina produce 80% of these total ALAs. The opportunity is in these high growth states where they have high hazards. And we looked at 67 counties, which were the high growth, high hazard, and low code or code opportunities to produce a significant benefit as a focus. The other opportunity is with the residential buildings in every community, because they accumulate, again, maybe a small amount per home, but over the course of time across the community, all of those new houses contribute to significant savings for a community. And so that opportunity is there for every community across the country, whether it's adopting to the newest codes or whether it's getting engaged with the residential code. That is a priority. This next slide shows what happens when you take the 1.6 billion average annualized loss avoided over time for the next 20 years. As that accumulates, by 2040, at the current rate, the lower line you see here, the green dashes, that is what would happen if the current number of about 400,000 buildings per year continues for the next 20 years. And that number grows into an average annualized loss avoided of 3.2 billion. However, if you look at the heavy line as the actual number of buildings, we take a best fit through that, which is more of a historic average over 20 years, not just the post housing crash in 2008. Then we're up at 4.2 billion, the average annualized loss avoided by 2040. That's happening every year. So then when you accumulate that, you end up with big numbers, 133 to 171 billion, depending on which curve we go. So there's a great opportunity in the next 20 years that's going to be producing a much bigger loss avoided, carrying forward the momentum of the past 20 years. So we can see the tremendous impact that is coming our way and the opportunity for new communities to engage and push those numbers higher. That's assuming the same adoption percentage, but as new communities adopt modern codes, that number goes higher. As technology improves in the codes, the opportunity for that number to go higher exists as well. So in preparing the report and looking at the findings, we felt these were conservative projections, and just from the standpoint of the losses avoided of the codes. This third slide, before I hand it back to Jonathan, illustrates how building code savings ripple across a community. And if you consider the two curves representing two different cities or communities that are hit by natural disasters, they're able to recover more quickly, the one with the codes in the upper line. And those savings are able to then be reinvested and help them prepare better for the next event. So over a series of events, the community with the codes becomes far better prepared and far more tuned for growth. And that also happens because with homes that are protected, families are able to shelter in place, they're more stable. Schools and community lifelines are able to function better. And so the communities are more stable, the economy is more stable, and that's what drives the growth. And so it all starts with building codes as a catalyst and focusing again on the residential opportunity, which represents a significant sizable growth in capital when you consider time again and the community-wide impacts. And that's really the main message that we're able to draw from this very detailed analysis, that each community can look at their own particular hazards and find their best path forward to growth.
Thank you, Matthew. Now remember the third goal of the study, to incentivize greater code adoption. We realized that a big nationwide technical study doesn't always motivate local change. So we developed a companion brochure to use our results to tell a compelling story for local officials and the public. We know that historic disasters bring real-life motivation. In fact, today's hazard-resistant codes incorporate many lessons learned from past disasters, as we've described. We also know that motivations for local change always tie into local stories somehow. So the brochure starts by setting the stage for why codes are important in today's environment of increasing hazards and disasters. Then provides regional examples of the effects of disasters on communities. Highlights some communities that have successfully used codes to break the chain of destruction, and provides justification using our study results and a call to action and details on how to achieve greater code adoption in your community. I want to take a moment to highlight some areas that have successfully used codes to break the chain of destruction. Some states have done this by adopting modern statewide building codes that protect property and people during natural disasters. Florida and California, pioneers in this field, have had modern hazard-resistant building codes in place since the 1990s. Other states such as Virginia, New York, and Montana have followed suit, putting in place statewide building codes that local jurisdictions are required to adopt. Other states have broken the chain from the bottom up. That is, local jurisdictions have pushed the envelope with the adoption of hazard-resistant building codes and raised the bar on their home states to do the same. For example, Miami-Dade County in Florida raised the standards for roof construction and mandated the use of impact-resistant windows. The state incorporated these requirements into its mandatory statewide code. Similarly, the city of San Antonio blazed a new trail in the state of Texas with the regular adoption of modern code updates every 3 years. Other jurisdictions in Texas can provide a higher level of protection to their citizens and regularly adopt modern building codes too. Cedar Rapids, Iowa. As part of its 2008 flood recovery, the city worked closely with state officials to increase their resilience to flooding. They implemented a variety of measures, including reassessing flood risks, buying high-risk properties to create a new greenway, building a new levee, and most importantly, adopting modern building codes. This comprehensive package of measures was put to the test in 2016 by the second highest flooding on record. Cedar Rapids performed well, with much less damage than the 2008 flood. In conclusion, the regular adoption of modern hazard-resistant building codes brings compelling economic benefits and cost savings for all states and communities. We've shown that those who have adopted them are avoiding $1.6 billion on average in annualized losses in just building and contents damages alone. Even communities with low and moderate hazard areas benefit from the combined savings of multi-hazard provisions in the model codes, including reduced damage from all hazards by generally having stronger and more durable buildings. Accumulated code savings over time, even in small communities, can proportionally still make the difference between a debilitating disaster and a resilient recovery. Lastly, we found that the data and methods we used for this study were effective in achieving our goals. And so we have ideas for future follow-on studies to evaluate other hazards and codes, for example. In demonstrating the monetary benefit of hazard-resistant building codes and showing how they reduce damages from natural hazards, we've proven that the adoption of strong building codes makes mitigation standard practice for communities across the country. I hope that you enjoyed learning about our study and how building codes save. For more information, I encourage you to visit our website, download the brochure, check out the study, and reach out to help us create more building code advocates.